would shout. Happy Palm Sunday.
Happy Palm Sunday.
This is one of my favorite Sundays of the year. There's something so beautiful about gathering together, holding on to these palms, singing joyfully as the story tells us the disciples did that day as Jesus entered triumphantly into Jerusalem. And this Sunday, this Palm Sunday, works for me at least on a couple of different levels. Yeah. So the first level is the fact that we, together in community, get to reenact some of the story of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. The story that is told more or less the same in all three synoptic Gospels. I imagine the disciples that day as they gathered, as Jesus was brought into Jerusalem, ripping palms off the trees that surrounded them, wanting something to wave in the air in their joy, in the triumph they felt, in the anticipation that they all felt of this king who was coming in their midst. They sort of recreated a procession, a kingly, royal procession, but because it was Jesus, a king of kind of an upside-down kingdom, the procession looked a little different than one might expect for royalty. Instead of Jesus entering Jerusalem on some massive horse, a steed of power with some sort of beautiful textiles laid across his back, Jesus enters on a donkey, on a colt, sure-footed and small, with someone's coat thrown across the back. Instead of a king that enters with silks and textiles kind of thrown on the ground for him to walk on, instead people that day were taking the very coats off their back and throwing them on the ground, and the palms that they had grabbed and putting them on the ground to sort of mark the path as Jesus entered into Jerusalem. So we have joy, we have anticipation of a king, but a different kind of king, perhaps, than what was proclaimed, what was expected at the time. This Sunday also works for me in a sort of more metaphorical way. It's the beginning of Holy Week, the end of our journey through Lent, through the wilderness, and we get to start Holy Week in joy, holding these palms. And these palms, they're beautiful, but they're also kind of fragile, thin. They kind of rip apart pretty easily if you try. So for me, they kind of also represent this thin place that we enter together as a community. This thin place of Holy Week, this place where the barriers between joy and pain, the barrier between life and death, and the barrier between death and life again becomes thin and fragile and tender. That is the place where we start today. So we enter Holy Week together with these palms, and we look forward to a series of liturgies, a series of times where we can come together, where we walk through the story, as Maria mentioned, the story that goes back centuries. These worship liturgies, these ways that we come together, are ways that people in the faith have been walking and singing and living together for thousands of years. And so we have an opportunity, my friends, this week to do the same together. And while it is a thin place, a fragile place, it is also a place where we can plant our feet, where we can experience the love of God in all the aspects of the story that we hear this week. In the joy that we hear this morning, and in the pain that we will hear in not too long, in 30 minutes or so, when we read the Passion Gospel. In some of the more obscure sort of social media Episcopalian corners of the internet, there's a debate that goes on around this time of year of whether or not we should read the Passion Gospel on Sunday. Is this a Sunday when we should sit firmly in the joy of Jesus' triumphal entry, or should we also share together the story of Jesus' pain and his crucifixion. And I kind of understand both sides of it. In the past, I've actually really struggled with the fact that we read the Passion Gospel on Sunday, in part because it feels like it's just kind of a concession to the world. It's a concession that says, well, we don't think people are going to show up for Maundy Thursday or Good Friday, so we better get this story in today so people hear it. So they don't think we just go from joy on Palm Sunday to joy on Easter Sunday without walking the journey in between. And I think that's some of it. But I've also been reflecting these past few days on the tension that's in this day, the tension that's in all of Holy Week. This tension between the joy that we feel at Christ entering the world, at Christ entering Jerusalem, and the pain that will also be part of his journey. Because, my friends, even if we want to sit firmly in this joy, Christ himself was not firmly, I imagine, in this joy. He himself knew entering that morning in Jerusalem on the back of that colt what was coming. He went to Jerusalem knowing that he was going to die. So in the way that the Apostle Paul encourages us to put ourselves in the mind of Christ Jesus, perhaps this is a way this morning that we can enter into that, holding both these truths, that we can have joy and fear together. The other part of having the Passion as part of today's liturgy is a reminder that the people that day in the crowd who earlier in the week were singing Hosanna were probably the very same people who yelled, "Crucify him," not but a few days later. And so it's an opportunity for us to reflect on our own journeys of faith. Where do we plant our feet? Would we too be caught in this sort of fluttering of the power of the crowd? Where would we find ourselves in this story? In today's gospel in Luke, when the powers that be are telling Jesus that his disciples need to be quiet, that he's causing too much of a stir, it's a threat. All these people proclaiming Hosanna is a threat to the powers that be, the religious and the political powers of that time. Tell them to be quiet, the powers tell him, and Jesus responds, "I tell you, if these were silent, even the stones would shout out." Even the stones would shout out. That story, that line, "even the stones would shout out," reminds me of one of my favorite lines in all of Scripture from the prophet Ezekiel. That God will take from me this heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. God's power can do that. God's love can transform even a stone to sing with joy, can transform those hard places in us and make them soft and tender with God's love. So one of my sort of hopes for myself this week, and I'd like to invite you all into that if you are so inclined, is to stay fully present, to feel in our bodies these stories that we tell, to feel in our bodies the worship that we do together. There are opportunities this week that we only get once a year, washing each other's feet, putting our hands on the wood of the cross. And so I brought today these stones, and if you feel so inclined, you can grab one today during the peace or as you go up for the Eucharist, or I'll have them out in the parish hall. And maybe hold on to these this week. And know that despite the pain, despite the death, there is joy, and even the stones will shout. God is with us, my friends. God's love has the power to transform us in ways that we cannot even imagine. God's love has the power to transform the world so that even the stones will shout out. Amen.
Amen.